what I'm going to talk about is gamelan makers, really more than gamelan making. And it's really a sort of a mashup of some of my interests and experience. This is just a part of the research, and it's sort of based on my interest in being a gamelan student, in occupational safety actually is something I know a little bit about, so I sort of have an interest in that. It's also, I've done some work with skilled labor, especially around construction and craftsmanship, so I'm interested in sort of how people learn. And also, I am interested in tropical ecology and forestry and political ecology. So I have sort of a few different interests I bring to this. So hopefully some of those will be resonant with other folks on the call. And what I'm going to talk about was based on data I collected during my master's research. So I was in Solo for about 3 months and mainly doing ethnography, basically, trying to learn a little bit more about who is making gamelan right now, how they're doing it, what kind of materials they're using, that sort of thing. So those are some of my interests. And sorry, hold on a second, something odd is happening in my computers. I apologize for that. Sorry, Matt, something very strange is happening on my side.
Looks good over here.
Okay. So anyway, I'm sorry about that, folks. My goals, basically my goals for this talk are to, for folks who may not have visited some of the workshops and whatnot in Solo, is to kind of give people a feeling for what the gamelan factories are like and generally how things are made. To talk about some of the materials used in gamelan, and in this talk, I'm going to focus mainly on wood, and then I'm also going to touch on some of the sort of ethnographic data I collected about gamelan makers, and in particular, where does this conversation about materials lead us, especially around issues of kind of competition and labor, and how gamelan is essentially how people are talking about capitalism and being business people as well as craftspeople and cultural figures. And as a sort of sidebar, I'm not, I mean, I know the title of this is Gamelan Masters. I don't consider myself a master or even really an expert on this. I mean, I'm interested in the topic, but I also know that there are a lot of people on this call who have, who have a lot of experience and know a lot. And I'm also, I'm anxious to hear from some of you. I'm hoping that you will all sort of chime in and tell us what you think. And so as a really quick introduction, in the workshop, and this is kind of what Javanese gamelan is probably most famous for, is that, on the left you can see there's some copper wiring and some tin ore. In the middle picture, there's this charcoal fire that's fed by, it's superheated it has some oxygen being pumped into it, some extra air, and they're melting it together. Picture on the right is someone doing kind of a test to see if the resulting bronze has the right consistency. And at that point, it's put into the fire and sort of hammered into shape. And there's this process of putting it on and taking it off and hammering it. And then usually the process of like kind of cold hammering when it's out of the fire. And then on the right, someone is starting to sort of voice the gong and then tune it, which is, I guess, the thing that requires the most skill. And And so we wanted to give that brief overview, and I think Matt has a quick video that he's going to play that I think a friend of Nusantara Arts was able to take in solo, which is a pretty nice short video. So if there are folks who haven't had a chance to go to the Besselin and see, the workshops and see how they're made, I think it'll be really good to spend, I think it's like 3.5 or 4 minutes.
I just put the link to that in the chat. It's a YouTube video. So grab that from the chat box and go to YouTube on your computer and put that in and watch the video. It's the video from a bronze gamelan factory right outside of Solo. So everybody take the time to watch that. It's sort of showing this process in action a bit quickly, and then come back and we'll do it. Yeah, this is Tim Sager's video. He's the husband of one of the members of our group.
Okay, Great, thank you. So I hope everyone had a chance to look at it. I feel like the Gamelan workshops are fascinating places. They're also they're really dangerous places. And I mean, Indonesia does have some worker protection laws and frameworks, but there's not a lot of oversight. There's not a lot of training. And it seems like that one of the things that I think is worth keeping in mind is, just how loud, smoky, and hot they are. No one's really wearing that much protective equipment. There's a lot of repetitive stress, injury risk. There's extreme heat. There's also often compressed gas like acetylene that's left next to open fires. So it's just something to keep in mind as we're thinking about this kind of skilled artisanal labor, that there are a lot of issues. A lot of this is actually covered really well in some other literature about metalworking in Java, which I'm happy to send out to people. Next thing I wanted to do was just share one quote from Jaap Kunst, who obviously is a very influential early ethnomusicologist. And I think that the reason why I share this is because I think it's, besides obviously he loved the sound of a gong, which I think a lot of people here have a very deep appreciation for as either composers or musicians or instrument makers. But I think it also is important because it sort of presents gamelan as something that's essentially timeless. And I think that it's important for us to always remember, we do have this kind of intellectual heritage or lineage of, Orientalism or cultural essentialism that is hard to escape, I think. I think largely we don't really see culture as fixed anymore, but we see it as more mobile and fluid. But I think it's also interesting because he leaves us actually wondering who actually made the gongs and how did they do it. He doesn't tell us really anything about. I mean, he does ask it in some of his other research, but in this kind of more dramatic writing. So when I started to read it, I really wondered about the kind of circumstances and livelihoods of gamelan makers. And I think it's also useful because it introduces questions of sort of class and consumerism and money. When he mentions, the best people, the best instrument, or the richest people and the best instruments. So the idea of gamelan as this kind of consumable good is really important as well. So it got me really thinking about how gamelan makers are essentially entangled in capitalism. And I think that that's really important because we really need we need ways of thinking about culture because globalization and capitalism are really complicated, and it's not, we can't have oversimplified narratives of gloom and doom all the time. So I became interested in really questions of materials. Part of this is, I remember when I was working with Pak Midi when we were in Chicago. He came to work with us, and he one day just mentioned kind of offhand, he was tuning a drum or something, and he said, that it's really hard to find jackfruit trees that are this big anymore in Java. And it kind of it's just like many things that he says, for a lot of people, it gets stuck in your head and you can't stop listening to it or thinking about it. So I found myself several years later going back to school and sort of wondering whether this was an important question. And what I sort of started to think about was, I went into the project thinking, was access to materials an issue? Do people have the right kind of wood, enough wood? Was one place I was interested, coming from a forestry program. And what I realized is that there's just the manufacture of gamelan brings so many different materials and so many different landscapes and so many different people into it that it's a really interesting place to look at sort of labor and supply chains and that sort of thing. And the picture is just this sort of an example of the types of materials that get drawn into gamelan. On the left is a pretty standard for a gamelan smith to have big bags of charcoal just to keep the fires running all the time. And most people told me that the charcoal was made in teak plantations but they basically make it from the little branches that are sort of left behind. So they're not even really very big pieces of wood. The middle obviously is for most people would recognize as a jackfruit tree, which is really important for making drums and also other things that are not gamelan, right? Making furniture and things like that. And then on the right is a picture of basically some clothing, some rags from cast off rags that are used by a mallet, someone who kind of specialized in making tabu, like gamelan mallets, and using them to pad some of the soft mallets, like the gong mallets. So it got me kind of thinking about how there are people behind all these materials. Someone has to collect those rags. There's a whole kind of set of industries behind it as well. And so, there's a lot of, there's this sort of wide array of materials. There's a lot of things that are very local, like a lot of the trees, but there are a lot of things that are really very regional or even international. And so I think it's also important to think and to consider some of the sort of social and environmental issues that are implicated. We already saw the picture of copper and tin, and most of the tin in Indonesia comes from Bangka Island. And Bangka Island is a kind of environmental disaster, but it's not necessarily because of gamelan. It's really because of smartphones, which is what most tin is used for. So I think a lot of gamelan makers have access to material supply chains that don't necessarily exist because of gamelan, but they're able to tap into. And this also leads to a lot of sort of specialization as well. There's on the top right, or I should say the middle picture on the top is just pictures of recycled sheet metal. And there are a couple people in Solo whose basically only job is to make those resonator tubes for Slempum and Gender. So it's a very kind of specialized skill, but mainly their success relies on the availability of basically scrap metal. And at least one person told us they come from containers that are shipped from Japan and other places to Indonesia, and they're kind of rust proof because they're galvanized. So in one sense, this probably shouldn't surprise us that there's a lot of sort of substitutions or flexibility. I mean, we know from the gong making in Semarang paper, which is a really early paper that's really pretty comprehensive, that even as early as the early 20th century, people were melting down old boilers to make gongs. But I think what perhaps is new is just the sort of complexity and scale of a lot of the supply chains. And I think that is an opportunity for people, but also it involves a certain level of risk and also precarity, in the sense that they're reliant on others and on other processes. And so it ends up making some of the social relationships and the networks of the gamelan makers even more important, in my opinion. So I think I'm going to talk, for this brief presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about wood, because I think that it's sort of a resource that's available locally. And there are some sort of case studies, I think, that can help us think about how people are responding to how people are using resources and responding to scarcity and things like that, and gaining access to the resources they need. And so I think most people are probably familiar with, that teak is often used for making parts of the gamelan, and jackfruit is really common for drums. And just in the interviews I did over 3 months, I found that there were about 20 kinds of wood that people sort of reported using for different purposes and different reasons, whether it was making, carving the body of a rabab, making the frames and the stands, carving gambang, keys, making mallets. And wood kind of comes from all over people's backyards, plantations, even, some of the hardwoods come from the forests in Kalimantan. And there is a a great deal of substitution of different kinds of wood, but there's also, a sense that sort of certain kinds of wood are best for certain instruments based on their properties. So teak is pretty resistant to termites, so it's great for having gamelans in a place where there's lots of termites. And there's a lot of teak in Java. Something like ironwood is really hard to get because you're not supposed to export it from Kalimantan or other places, but it's a really slow-growing hardwood, and it's really preferred for things like gambangs where you need that like really resonant wood. And another example is on the right-hand side of this slide is just a pile of wood, but I'm pretty sure it is what they were calling kayu marbau, which I think is like Bornean teak. It's also called ipil tree, and I believe, and I think it's really people really prefer it for making gambang because of its resonance and how bright the sound is. So for an instrument like gambang, people will go to great lengths to acquire the wood. They'll buy it when it's available. They have brokers or middlemen who will help to find it. They'll go to lumber yards. Sometimes wood is reclaimed from old buildings. So it's sort of, maybe not surprising the same way that somebody would sort of buy up old chestnut boards who wanted to do some woodworking, but sort of similar patterns around going to great lengths to find the wood needed. A lot of carvers will operate alone, but there are also sort of clusters of larger carving shops. So that's something that we'll sort of talk a little bit more about in a minute. So I want to talk a little bit about how, at least the group of folks I talked to who are in Solo and in some of the surrounding villages, how people are sort of organized. There are some folks who sort of do everything, who make the entire set of instruments, but I found it to be kind of rare. It seems like mostly everyone knows each other, and there's a healthy amount of sort of friction and partnership. It also seems like that it's really common for people to focus on a specific instrument or a specific, if they're in a region where there's a lot of timber, then there's the opportunity to carve the parts of the instruments that need wood. It seems like, so most of the time it seems like if you call someone and ask for a gamelan, they don't, typically the question is, what do I have in stock? Who do I need to call? Who can help to fill the rest of the order out so that I can get it to this person as quickly as possible? So there's a lot of sort of subcontracting and assembling the order as quickly as possible. This means that larger workshops that have more capital, and often those are the bronze workshops because they need more money to be able to buy expensive materials, often will have the primary sort of customer relationship, and thus the ability to dictate prices and sort of manage other people, for example, a drum maker as a subcontractor. So it's like having the relationship is really the key to being entrepreneurial, having the customer relationship. In terms of labor, most people are paid either per piece finished or per day. And I think that it's interesting because it sort of allows workshop owners some control over the relationship between labor and production. But whereas, we might think of, sort of contract labor as a way that owners of companies can sort of universally control, make a workforce smaller, make it cheaper to run, make people less important to have around. It actually seemed like most people I spoke to felt like they really needed their staff, that it was really skilled labor, and that it was in their best interest to keep people producing and keep people happy, keep them working. And there were at least one occasion of a workshop owner telling me that they had tried to to organize, to pay their workers all the same way, like all per day or for what they had finished, but the workers actually wanted a more flexible arrangement, and they really felt like that it was that they couldn't afford to have their workers quit, and they needed them to work. And so so people are looking for work. Labor is not scarce in a sort of absolute sense, but it's really critical to ensure that there's enough inventory and there's enough production so that when the call does come for an order, it can be filled and profit can be made. And I think another way that I'm thinking about this is there is, for some larger gamelan makers, it's not really worth it for them to train somebody and have one person who just makes those, what we saw earlier, the resonator tubes for called bumbung for a slempum or a gender, because it's not really enough work to have someone who just does that. So it's actually cheaper. It makes more sense for them just to focus on making the bronze, and then hiring out someone to supply those tubes. So, oops, try to go to the next slide here. So, okay, but access to materials is not, it's not necessarily, it's not only contingent on the availability or scarcity of a type of wood in question. It's also really relative to who you know. And so some of the people who own carving factories especially pointed out that it wasn't so much of a question of, for something like a stand for a drum on the right or something, it wasn't really a question of needing a specific kind of wood like you would for a gambang, but it was, what was available and what's the price. And that there were a lot of varieties of small trees that could be used for certain things, but that her husband, who handled some of the material sourcing, he really spent a lot of his time bargaining with people and working with middlemen who wanted commissions. So, and the problem that this particular carver had really is that everybody's carving, and there's a lot of people are trying to unload a lot of their inventory. So competition has driven the prices way down. People are trying to get out of debts, which I think could be another. I didn't have a lot of chance to dig into that, but I think it's another sort of question as to like what those debts are from, and what that sort of means for people economically. So there's a whole situation where, the gamelan has a ceiling price. There's only so much that you can ask for a ranchan, like a rack for a bonang or something. But there's also this kind of watering down of prices, and it creates a lot of uncertainty for some of the wood carvers. And in fact, it is also true that there's at least one carver we met who that basically people will move. They'll move their center of production to be closer to those cheap, accessible materials. And we ran into at least one carver who had moved to the outskirts of Solo, brought all of his sort of brothers and cousins in. I think eventually it turned out to be cheaper for them to find wood, especially things like teak and nanka, jackfruit and things like that, out in the village. Some of the people he trained to work with in his shop in Solo moved back to the village, opened up their own shop, and now kind of everybody's carving, but no one has enough work. So it's kind of an interesting tension. And this also kind of affects these sort of pressures of production and materials also affect the way people are harvesting. So we met at least one carver who told us that that his idea, the things that he was taught by his father and his grandfather, what in my kind of field of forestry and environmental studies, political ecology we would call traditional environmental knowledge. He knew that you weren't supposed to cut trees in the dry season because the trees are there's not as much sap, they're more susceptible to termites. But his point was that that production couldn't wait, that people wanted gamelan, whether it was somewhere in Sulawesi or in England or America, wherever it was, or the Indonesian government wanted to place an order, and that there was a lot of pressure and no one could wait, and that there wasn't this practice of waiting for favorable kind of auspicious days on the Javanese calendar, but let's get it done in a hurry. And he really felt that would decrease the quality, that the instruments and the wood would be weaker, they wouldn't last as long. So that was a really interesting kind of perspective that we came across. So this is kind of how I started to think about, very simplistically, just the sort of concerns that gamelan makers brought up. They talked a lot about access to capital and the sort of fluctuations of demand. It seemed like there was no real regular, for a lot of folks, there wasn't a regular amount of demand. So it was really hard to modulate how much to spend on labor and materials. We talked a little bit about material access and price. I think that's equally difficult if not more so, when it comes to the metal that's needed, because it's really expensive. There's questions about how to keep labor, how to keep skilled labor, and then there's also a whole kind of piece of this that I don't know if I'll have a chance to get into here, but kind of about the way the Indonesian government is really interested in as a lot of people I think in this chat or this call know, they're really interested in placing gamelans all over Central Java and other places in a lot of sort of public buildings and government buildings. Those instruments may or not ever be played, but they certainly provide for a lot of folks a pretty steady supply of work. But I think a lot of people felt that some of the smaller providers felt that because of some of the economic reforms and the work on corruption in the sort of the way the state sort of solicits these proposals, that smaller producers were really sort of forced out of that deal because they didn't have enough capital. They didn't have enough inventory to prove that they could do these big projects, and they needed a middleman who was a sort of limited liability corporation. And oftentimes those middlemen they just take a cut, and it's a whole industry of people who have moved into this world of the reformed economy, and whether it's gamelan making or road building, their business is basically to set up the LLC and take a cut whether they do anything or not. So there was a lot of tension around that relationship with the state, and that also created tension between larger and smaller gamelan makers, which I thought was kind of interesting. I'd love to know if anyone knows more about that. And I wanted to talk a little bit about a couple of case studies just that I thought were interesting, to think about, because as I started to think about gamelan makers, and I kept telling myself, this is about gamelan makers, and as I met more and more people who had, more and more jobs, I wondered, are these people really gamelan makers? And because they do many other things. And so the picture in the middle, and I've given these people sort of pseudonyms, hopefully that's enough. But the picture in the middle is of who we'll call Susilo, and the woman on the left is Nana, who was amazing. She helped me find everyone and talk to everyone, and to the extent that she could, help me not make a fool of myself in most of our conversations. She was really wonderful and sort of patient. And I would say that anything that kind of makes sense from this is a directly result of her efforts. And also another friend of mine, Mas Harry, who probably many people know, who was really wonderful and took me to his father's workshop and just sort of taught me a lot about what was going on in the gamelan industry and other things. So I just wanted to say that before I forget. So this guy was an older guy, and he had actually worked not just as a gamelan maker, it was sort of a side project. And you can kind of, I mean, if you look at the carving on the right, you can kind of tell that it's not up to the quality that you would see in other workshops, like in and around Solo. But he was also a musician. He was also a carpenter. He worked on farms, and he basically taught himself how to make instruments. And he also, what was really interesting about his story was just the way it was kind of woven into a lot of major events in Javanese history. He remembered when the Japanese had occupied Java. He remembered collecting old railroad ties that had been left behind as the Japanese were building sugarcane plantations. So he could go out and collect, pieces of iron for free. Just a couple of years ago, he told us that he was about 90 years old. He was still taking the bus to 2 hours or something to go bring back some scrap iron to make instruments with. So it actually gotten much harder for him over time. And he was also, he didn't have a whole lot to say about how he made the instruments, and basically thought we should just go to Solo and ask people there, which I thought was really interesting. But he also had a really shared an interesting experience of, when he was a little younger, when there were the communist purges were happening, the way basically gamelan itself had shut down. Just that he had lived through this period where people stopped going outside and stopped getting together to play music because it was too dangerous to be seen with people. It was too risky. And so I thought it was, it was really interesting to think about the way all of these kind of historical events and extra local events all really changed his life and the way he played and made gamelan. And it made me think a lot about, just sort of maybe how history repeats itself. So this is our next sort of case study. He was a drum maker near Solo. And this is someone who worked a series of really low wage, physically exhausting jobs. I mean, he was a driver, he was a dancer, he was a rubber tapper. I think he worked on a seaweed plantation. He had traveled all over the Indonesian archipelago, kind of, on the outskirts of basically of sort of different parts of the capitalist economy and the extractive economy, but he never really could make it work. And he finally decided to move back to Solo because he was from Java. And he thought, I think I can really find a niche. I can make a livelihood by learning how to carve. So he wasn't, his workshop wasn't a fourth generation workshop or anything. He just decided this is something I need to do. So he bought some books, looked on YouTube, and basically taught himself how to play, not just gamelan drumming, but he taught himself how to play drum, and then he taught himself how to carve. And the picture in the middle is actually he had kept the first drum he had ever tried to carve as he was learning, and he was pretty depressed at that time. I think he didn't think he'd make it, and he also, as a smaller producer, really felt he felt the strain. He felt a lot of risk. His margins were really tight. The picture on the right is from a log that he had rented a truck to go and get this tree. And there's always a risk that, if the tree is not sound throughout, that you won't be able to use it. And so he was really dealing with a lot of those types of pressures as a smaller producer. And so, so there's a lot of, what I kind of took away from this was that there's a lot of risk, there's economic risk, there's risk around the materials, there's all these sort of political and cultural risks. But it's just not just limited to small manufacturers, because there were a lot of larger workshops that really were struggling to transmit knowledge between generations. And that was because sometimes kids just didn't really want to work in those workshops because they'd rather get a job at the mall. And the sort of cultural capital that one might get from being a gamelan master maker just wasn't really that appealing to them. But there was also many people who, I would say a handful of people who shared a story of their father dying quite suddenly before they were really able to learn the process of, especially bronze gamelan makers, before they were learn the process of tuning and developing their own tuning and umbat, which I'd love to hear other people describe in more detail. Basically, there was one person who told me that the first gamelan he had to tune, he just sat down in a room by himself because his father had died and he didn't have anyone to teach him, and someone was waiting for it. So he just tried to figure out how to do it all by himself, which seemed, you know, to me, it's sort of, I had an image in my mind of this was a sort of a traditional path that people took and they learned through generations, and that really kind of upset that idea for me. It was very challenging in that sense. And so I think we're going to show one more quick video. But before I do that, and Matt's going to cue it up. But I also wanted to just say thank you for listening. And I hope that some of it was interesting. It was kind of short, but I wanted to make sure we had enough time to sort of have a conversation, because I think there's a lot of people with a lot of experience and good questions. And I don't know that I touched on topics that people are actually really interested in. So I'd love to just say thank you. And one of the things I wanted to point out is that the video that Matt's going to show is very short, but it is actually of a workshop near Solo, I think in Sukoharjo, and it is a video of a machine that one of the gamelan makers made, and so in contrast to the sort of manual hammering that we saw in the first video, you'll see in this video that this guy basically had some engineers design a hydraulic press, basically. So instead of hammering, they take the gong off of the fire and they put it on this press, and then they sort of they work it around in circles, in these concentric circles, to try to flatten out the metal. So I think it's a really interesting. I found out about it sort of towards the end of my research. And I don't know that much about it yet, but I think it's a really interesting demonstration also of how people are investing in technology and investing in kind of innovation. And I hope that it will be at least thought-provoking. So I'm going to stop talking and put myself on mute, and Matt's going to play a video. And then, Matt, I'll just turn it over to you for any discussion that people want to have.
Yeah, definitely. So I have the link to this other short video in the chat box if everybody wants to check that out. It is very short. It's only like 2 minutes long, or maybe even less than that. So do that. And then think of some really good questions, because we're going to do a Q&A session. And I know we also have Medianto on the call. And I think I saw Harry on the call too, who's Peter name dropped. Harry's father is a gamelan maker. He actually made a lot of instruments that we have here in Buffalo. So if Harry wants to jump in at all with his thoughts, that'd be cool too. So yeah, check that out, and we'll meet back here in maybe 2 minutes. All right, everybody. I'm going to open it up to questions here. So If anybody has any, or they want to queue up for some questions, put your name in the chat box so we can queue you up. Peter, I thought that was an awesome presentation. I think, oh, Peter, can you stop your, actually, I'm gonna stop your share here. There we go. Yeah, I think it was an interesting conversation because a lot of people play instruments, but aren't really, or have never encountered the gamelan making process. You know, if it's a set of instruments that you have been playing on in a community group, or if there's some antique instruments at, you know, somewhere at a university or something like that, yeah, that's not something that you have to worry about. But in Indonesia, it's just an ongoing thing. People are still buying gamelan all the time. So it's a fascinating topic. And I do have a question here from Mike Awe. So Mike Awe, Peter knows from Chicago. So Mike, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, or do you want me to ask for you?
Sure. Hi. Hi, Pete. Hi, Matt. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you again, Pete. Fantastic talk. I got a lot of questions. I'm going to hog the time, but I won't. You said the tin comes from Banca. Where does the copper come from?
Seemed like most people just were buying copper wiring.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I think because it's pure, right? It has to be sort of pure for construction and other purposes. So, I mean, I don't exactly know where that, I don't offhand, I don't know where that copper ore comes from to make the wiring, but it wasn't like sourced as pure ore.
Okay.
Which I think was an advantage to people because they could take as much as they needed for the job they were doing rather than trying to sort of cut through a giant block of pure copper or something.
All right, I got a question here from Wayne. I don't know how to pronounce your last name, Wayne Vitale.
Hi, yes, that's right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, my question has to do with the people who become Pandey gongsmiths nowadays, and to what degree that's changed in recent years. Like my understanding, and you can correct me if this is wrong, is that it used to be mostly in family lineages. So I'm wondering if in more recent years there's more kind of social or economic mobility. Like, could one of the workers in a shop aspire to become the Pandey, and after he gets enough experience?
I'm happy to try to answer that, but I also would defer to others on the call who might know more about it than I do. From the people I spoke with, it seemed like there was a sense that there was more mobility, but amongst some of the folks I talked to who were more sort of multi-generational shops, that it was really supposed to be something that was passed down in a family lineage, which is not to say that every person would get it. But I did speak to at least two workshop owners who were not, they got their start in a gamelan workshop and they were smart and talented, but didn't come from that background. So it's, I don't know broadly whether like how big that trend is though.
Yeah, I don't know if Midianto or Harry, you want to jump on at any time to help clarify, feel free. There's a question here from Mark Perlman. Do you want to jump on, Mark, and ask your question?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, Mark.
I know some of the people here. I don't know a lot of people. So, and Peter, I think I met you very briefly at a performance at Yale. But anyway, thank you so much for the presentation. I would like to just hear some more details about the forges, the Besalan and the Tukang Gong that we saw in the videos.
So I didn't take the first video. so I'm not sure I can speak to that in any detail. But maybe you can tell us, because I could be the person to answer that, or we could defer to Pakmidi or Harry or someone else. But what kind of details would you like us to would you like to sort of talk about?
Just yeah, who were the Pandey? Where did they learn from? And in the case of the second video with the hydraulic press, I assume that is only to supplement the hand working, because I can't imagine how they could use that to create the penchon, the knob
Right, yeah.
of a gong.
Right, yeah, it's basically, I think the guy who made that, Pak Saleh is his name, and he's a really interesting character. I don't know him that well, but he, I think, saw it as a sort of labor-saving device, and also as a way to reduce, the way he talked about it was also a way to reduce the strain on his workers, because the hammering is such hard work. And he spent a not insignificant amount of money, developing that thing, and according to him anyway. And so I think that was pretty interesting. It's also unclear to me, I don't know how good the gongs are or not. I don't know enough about bronze and gong making to have a feeling for that.
Actually, if that's just gives me a thought. You were talking about bronze as the material. I'm wondering if there is anyone still making iron gamelans today.
Yeah, there are a ton of people making iron gamelans. I should have been more clear about that. And many, especially a lot of the producers sort of outside of Solo, there are a lot of really great iron gong makers. You can get pretty good iron from like the sort of bottom of a truck, this kind of really dense, thick iron. So there's a lot of, I think iron gamelans have gotten better in quality over time. And I know Mas Harry's father makes really good iron instruments. So I think, I know Matt's instruments in Buffalo are iron and they sound really good. So there are quite a few iron. I would say, there might be more iron gong makers than bronze, possibly, especially if you look in the sort of rural areas.
I'll just jump on that for a second, since we do have that iron gamelan that we got from Pat Sarno. Yeah, so the iron they're using is recycled from the leaf springs on bus suspensions. So like there's these like thick iron plates, and they're buses that have gone to the junk, so they take those, and they're really nice because we actually have some older iron gamelan that I got from Bapak in my village, the original gamelan set that I acquired, that he had built himself out of basically some old sheet metal. And I think the newer methods of this recycled iron are much higher quality. Iron is a bit harder than bronze, so it does require a bit of forging. I have some videos of iron forging, a lot of hammering as well. But the sound is very nice. It's loud, rings out for a long time. I think the gongs and the bonongs and the kanongs are where you're going to see less of like that potential for perfect quality, just because of you're basically starting to make iron gongs out of oil drums and stuff like that. So the sustain on them is not quite so long. It's a much lighter weight metal at that point, because you're not using these thicker pieces of iron. You're using more of a thinner sort of sheet metal type iron. They require retuning regularly too, if you don't play them absolutely properly. We do want to get a bronze gamelan here in Buffalo at some point, and I hope we can raise that money in the future once all this is over with here. So I just
Peter?
got that out.
Well, Peter, just to follow that up, my understanding was that back in the day, iron was simply considered to be an inferior material than bronze for a gamelan, but it was cheaper. And I didn't actually see that many iron gamelans, not in Solo and Jogja, though I think out in the villages. I'm imagining that just the sort of general thriving of the economy has made bronze gamelans much more affordable to people. I don't know if there's been like inflation in the price that is driven it out of reach. So I wouldn't have expected to hear that it's iron gamelans that have multiplied and their makers have multiplied so much. Do you have any impression of that with that?
Well, my impression, and I would say it's an impression, it's not, I don't have like empirical data on this, but my impression is that, you know, that bronze gamelans are more expensive. So mainly people who are purchasing bronze gamelan are, you know, institutions or Westerners or just folks with more money. And in a lot of the villages, people are buying, you know, iron gamelan. But that's sort of, you know, there is a difference in price point. That's my impression. But I'd love to hear from, you know, from others who might have, you know, more of an idea.
I have a question here from Lois Anderson. Do you want to jump in, Lois? Oh.
Okay, I just have a question about designs on the wooden parts of the instruments. Who decides on the design? Are there names for those designs?
So I'll try to answer that. I'm not an expert on this particular topic. It seemed to me that most people were making a set of kind of common idioms in their designs because ultimately they were going to sell them. Most of the wood carvers were going to be selling their their gong stands and everything to another gamelan maker who was going to package it. And so it wouldn't, you know, if they had some really, really different design that wasn't a custom order, then it may not really work for them to be able to fulfill that need. So in other words, there's an interest in having a lot of inventory around that sort of similar design so that it can be moved quickly. That was kind of what I took away from it.
Thanks.
Got another question from Mike Awe. Go on, jump in, Mike.
Hey, Pete, you mentioned, I know you're a big, you have a lot of concerns about ecological damage that we're doing to the earth. And you touched on the availability of trees. And I actually remember Massimiliano mentioning that comment about jackfruit trees not being enough good ones around for drums. When you were there, did you get a sense that people were aware of the potential loss of trees and other raw materials? And if so, is there some kind of movement to address that, either the gamelan makers or the government?
You know, I know of one guy someone in West Java who I heard about who was making like bamboo, some kind of angklung or bamboo gamelan or something, and he was really interested in sort of sustainability and sustainable bamboo growth. But I didn't come across. I think people had a general awareness that either there was some government regulation, for example, for, you know, they have these legal wood stores now, and there's sort of attempts to track and trace sustainably harvested wood. You know, a lot of that is it's a little hard to, even if it's well-intentioned, it's a little hard to put into action. But I think there was a general awareness that the Indonesian government had banned things like ironwood from being exported from, you know, Kalimantan or something. But I think there was also a sort of general sense that there was that you move into a place to create to carve wood or something, and maybe you move there, like this one set of carvers had moved into this one village near Solo, a couple hours outside of it, that there was this kind of regional scarcity of suitable trees, so you had to go further to find it. Maybe you had to work a little harder. Maybe you would travel to a village somewhere, a forest somewhere, and seek out what the trees you wanted, or even some people would essentially invest in like tree futures. Go and buy a tree that you may not cut down for a few years, so that you'll have it, that kind of thing. So there were a lot of kind of creative ways that people were trying to ensure that they had access, and I think an awareness that there were some scarcity and some legal requirements.
Got a question from Otto Stuparitz. If you want to jump in, Otto, with your question.
Hey, Peter. Really great presentation. And hey, everyone else from Frog, who I haven't seen in a long time. You've been kind of talking a lot about just kind of capitalist production and the ecological, obviously the focus of what you're doing. And I was kind of just wondering about any religious or spiritual dimensions that also factored in. I know that's like a big general topic, but I guess in terms of the production, like, are there any like spiritual dimensions that really affected how this is being done? And if it's like, I guess with changing economic conditions, if that, I guess anything kind of about in that direction and how those are affecting it.
Yeah, that's a really big topic, and it's a complicated topic. So I can share a couple of sort of stories that I came across. I think one thing is there's actually a paper by I can send out to the group, but by an Indonesian researcher, I think at University Gajah Mada in Jogja, and it's sort of about how people near Solo are dealing with this, like, the sort of prevalence of more conservative kinds of Islam, and how a lot of gamelan makers are kind of feeling pressure. Maybe they want to observe some like traditional Javanese, like, religious kind of rules around making gamelan, but there's like social pressure to change some of those because because people are Muslim and increasingly conservative. So there's some tension there, I think. I also I think that a couple people also told us that in terms of like making gongs and sort of observing some of the spiritual aspects of that, which I'm by no means an expert on this topic, so I want to be careful about what I say and don't say. But that was pretty fluid too. That one person said, well, we had people come from Bali to buy a set of gongs or a set of gamelan. They make Balinese stuff, and that they brought their own materials and they sort of did their own version of like a slamatan or something, or their own offerings. And so it didn't have to be, like a traditional Javanese sort of ceremony or offering or something. So I thought that was kind of interesting, that it seemed like there was some, maybe not surprising, but just that a couple people sort of seemed to think that there was some flexibility, and that those religious questions were really were kind of incorporated into the kind of the business, right? That that those two aren't separate, which I think makes sense, right? I don't know that should be surprising, but I'd love to hear what other people know about that topic.
Next question I have here from Steve Loronga. Sorry, Steve.
So are you going to read the question, Steve, or should I read it?
Hello?
Oh, there you are.
Can you hear me, Peter?
Yes. We can hear you, Steve.
I'll read the question for Steve. He asks here, did you hear any interesting takes from people in the gamelan shops on the use of the term panjak, which is metalworker, to refer to gamelan musicians and or performers in drama troupes? Did you hear the term panjak used in this sense at all around solo?
I personally didn't, but it's a question for everyone.
No.
Yeah. If anybody does have that, we can get back to that. Next question, Rick Wallet. I believe Rick has a question, possibly?
Yeah, it's Richard in Oakland, California. I wanted to, continue with the topic of, the spirituality of creating materials out of iron and bronze. This was, in previous times and definitely ancient times, a really highly respected and revered profession. Often the people had titles like Mpu or Ki. Is that sort of tradition continuing? And if so, who gives the titles? Or does one take them for oneself?
I'm going to defer to someone else on that question if I can. Maybe I'd love to hear Pakmidi talk about this if possible.
Maybe Yanto turned his video off. He might not. Maybe he's not. He might not.
I think Pop Marsam might also be on.
Oh, yeah. I do know that, at least in my conversation, I talked to a lot of gamelan makers actually on Instagram and Facebook, just because I'm curious about the topic, and they still use the term empu. I'm not sure how it's used exactly these days, how it's given to different people, but the people I was talking to were still using the term at least.
And do gong makers also make kris?
It's a great question. I didn't come across anyone who was making kris in the same workshops or who talked about that as a sort of a part of their business, but it's possible. I know there's at least one person, I can send the link out, and the name and the details are escaping, but there's one person who made a set of instruments using the sort of kris technology that was being shown in solo like maybe a year ago or something. They're incredible. Not exactly sure why he did it, but they're remarkable. I'm happy to share that.
You mean sets of kris that might be tuned to slender and prelog? I'm just joking. Okay, thanks so much, Peter.
I think I saw pictures of that gamelan, Peter, actually. It was incredible looking, sort of like the way the metal is folded. Really incredible looking instruments. And I also know that there's some wood carvers that were students at EC, the music school, who made some really cool sort of new styles for cases for the gamelan instruments that are interesting. I have another question from Mike Awe here.
Oh, yeah, real quick. Any idea how many gamelans are being made per year in Central Java?
No. I mean, no, I don't. I think like Indonesia does keep statistics on that, but I wasn't able to find them during the period of my research.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure offhand.
Okay.
I got Usman here. Usman from Nusantara Arts jumping in with a question. So Usman, you want to jump in?
Sure. So you mentioned a couple people, at least one drum maker and someone whose father had died abruptly, who had taught themselves the skills they needed in order to produce drums or produce gongs and so on. But are there any like trade schools or vocational schools that you're aware of where people can go to learn these skills, or is this all either self-taught or taught through apprenticeships?
Yeah, good question. I know of one person who, like everybody knows, Mas Jokrik, who did study like organology at, I think at EC or maybe at SMKI. I don't remember if it was high school or university. So he was actually sort of trained as a musician and as an instrument maker. So I know that that people do that. I guess that wasn't a question that I asked everyone. I don't have like a good, it didn't come up a lot, but I don't know if that's because, you know, nobody studied it or just because it didn't come up.
And then I got a question from Dan Lesniak, also from Nusantara Arts. If you want to jump on, Dan. Sorry, I skipped you, Dan.
That's okay, Matt. I'm not mad. I'm in Matt's group. Thank you very much, Peter. This was very interesting. I was wondering, so our original set of instruments came from the family of Matt's old teacher, but then we commissioned a sort of, we rounded out the ensemble with a new commission that I was wondering how common that is to commission something expressly for export, and if that's like a sizable amount of new commissions.
When you say commission, do you mean, what exactly do you mean?
Oh,
like a specific tuning or a specific design or?
Oh, just that we didn't buy a gamelan that was already made.
Right.
It was, I believe it was from artisans in Wangiri, but I might be wrong about that.
Right.
And it was a specific tuning. I think the design was specifically purple, but I don't know if there was anything else that was specific.
Yeah, so yeah, there are a lot of, I mean, people are often, I mean, I think there's sort of a mix, like so there are a lot of, you know, sometimes older gamelans are bought, I mean, a lot of times and historically in the last 40 years, oftentimes they're bought by, at least anecdotally, I've heard that they're bought by wealthier people to sort of sit in their courtyard or something. Maybe they're not played, but they tend to be really high quality. I think there is like a question about whether gamelan are, you know, especially the bronze keys are like made, you know, as well as they used to be. I know Mas Harry's brother, Rhys Nander, is doing some research near Solo around, you know, with a gamelan maker who's using a particular method that is sort of more like lost knowledge of how to make the keys, how to make the willow. So there is some of that discussion about our older instruments sort of better. And I think a lot of the gamelans that are made, so I guess the short story is I don't know like the percentage of what's new and refurbished, but I think a lot of both are happening, and I think that a lot of the gamelans the government is buying, which is a pretty substantial portion of them, tend to be new instruments. But then there's a lot of this, you know, there are actually a lot of gamelan out there. I mean, if for people who are at the International Gamelan Festival, I mean, there were something like 2 miles of gamelan ensembles, just community groups that had instruments that were out playing all together in one place. So there, you know, there's a ton of sets, and not all of them are being played. So I think there is a lot of, like someone like Mas Jokrik, who's really well known and deals with a lot of Westerners and musicians in solo. He doesn't really have like a forge. He can order through someone who he likes, and then also he does a lot of this kind of refurbishment. So I think it's also just you know, what individual gamelan makers, who their clients are, and what their sort of business model is.
Okay, thank you.
Got a little information here from Jody Diamond. If you want to jump in with some more information about that, the sort of new method of stylization?
Well, just people were talking about an artist who is making gamelan instruments with the metal made the same way that kris are made. These are exhibited as sculptures in an art gallery. He had an exhibit during the International Gamelan Festival in Solo, and the metal it's really beautiful. It has all these lines and curves and stuff. So his name is Sigit Pamungkas, and we're working on an article with him for an upcoming issue of Balungen. But I think he operates more as an artist doing exhibits of instruments. So in the exhibit, nobody was playing the instruments, so I actually can't tell you how they sound. But so he's very involved in the making of them. And I just wanted to supply his name in case anyone was interested. Sean Hayward, who is in Solo at this time, is the one who did the interview with him.
Thanks, Jody. Last call for questions. If anybody has a burning question for Peter Ludwig about this topic. I do have one here. Laura, do you want to jump on and ask your question?
Sure. It's just something I've kind of been curious about. What you know about where the coatings or paints for the wooden parts are made of and where those materials come from?
Yeah, I mean, basically it's shellac and paint. So it's like, the hardware store and the paint store. I wish I had like a longer, more interesting answer, but I mean, I think that's also like interesting in itself, just that Solo is a kind of a pretty modern city in many ways, and people are just like, so, and I think also that speaks to to me, it also speaks to some of the occupational hazard issues, because, I think it's probably true throughout sort of whatever, I don't know if we're calling it the global South or the developing world, but countries that don't have good enforcement for safety and health rules, that there's a ton, there are hundreds of thousands of deaths every year from exposure to chemicals, and people are using a lot of like really nasty things in, especially when they're cleaning up old gamelans or painting or using shellac. And so.
I got one more question from Mike Awe.
Hey, so Pete, what was the most interesting or surprising thing you learned while you were there?
That's a good question. Thanks for asking that, Mike. The most surprising thing I learned, I think probably most people who have done either ethnography or have learned how to do it or have been to Java are like, it's an interesting place to be because it's a very, like Solos, to me, it seemed like a very complicated place. Like there's a lot that's not being said. But I thought I was always surprised that, it's a strange thing to walk into someone's place of business and just say, I'd love to sit down with you for an hour and talk to you about what you do. Even if you know someone or you have a friend, and so I always was amazed that people actually sat down and talked to me. And a lot of that I owe to Nana Daniswara, who helped me, John Rhea's wife. And she really helped me kind of find people and talk to them and make those kind of connections so that it wasn't as awkward just to be there. But I was always surprised by that.
Cool. Peter, want to say thank you again for doing this. It's been great. I think it's just a fascinating topic, and you did it justice here.
Thanks.
And so that's great. And then also, I just want to ask everybody once again, I'm asking you once again, if you haven't made a contribution to the Nusantara Arts Fund, if you could go to nusantaraarts.com and give a donation so that we can help preserve gamelan culture. That'd be great. I'll put the website in the chat. And we'll see you soon, next time.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Pete.
Take care.